Welcome to This Explainer. Today we're diving into a genuinely mind-bending analysis by Mark Bates. We are going to explore the limits of scientism, the logical traps it constantly falls into, and the unseen foundations of empirical science itself. Really, this is a deep dive into how we know what we know, and whether the tools we rely on to measure reality are actually capturing the whole picture. Let's get into it.
If you cannot scientifically verify or falsify your belief, then it has no meaning. Okay, let's stop right there. We've all heard some version of this, right? It's a hugely popular cultural maxim that basically acts as an intellectual gatekeeper today. The idea is that science is the absolute only valid way to arrive at truth, and anything that can't be tested in a lab, like ethics, aesthetics, or theology, is just subjective emotion, maybe a cultural myth. But as we'll see, the author argues that this seemingly bulletproof standard actually has a fatal logical flaw.
To unpack the author's argument, here's our roadmap. The empire of scientism, the self-refuting trap, science's unseen foundations, the theistic roots, and finally, a coherent alternative. Starting off with Section 1, the empire of scientism. Now, the author points out a massive difference right out of the gate between empirical science, which, is an incredibly productive method for investigating physical things, and scientism. Scientism is a comprehensive philosophical worldview. It generally comes in two flavors. First, there's strong scientism, which aggressively asserts that a claim is only true or meaningful if it is empirically verified. Then you have weak scientism. This one's a bit softer. It allows that fields like history might have partial insights, but insists that science is always the final arbiter of absolute truth. For this analysis, our focus is going to be squarely on the bold claims of strong scientism. Moving to Section 2, the self-refuting trap. So ask yourself this, is it actually possible to use a laboratory experiment to prove that only testable claims are true? I mean, really think about it for a second. Can you weigh the concept of truth on a scale? Can you put meaning into a test tube and measure its chemical reaction? And here is where the core premise just hits a brick wall. Let's trace the logic. The proposition is, only claims verified by empirical science are true. But when you ask if empirical science can verify that specific proposition, the answer is no. Why? Because the statement itself is not a scientific claim. It's a philosophical, metaphysical claim about science. By its own rigorous standard, strong scientism literally fails its own test. It's completely self-defeating. The author points out that scientism commits what philosopher Alfred North Whitehead called the fallacy of misplaced concreteness. Basically, this means taking a partial view of reality and treating it like it's the whole shebang. It is exactly like searching for a wooden treasure chest using a metal detector. To dismiss objective ethics or aesthetic beauty or conscious intentionality just because they can't be measured in a lab is a massive category mistake. The silence of the metal detector absolutely doesn't prove the wooden box doesn't exist. It just reveals the limitations of the tool you're using. And actually, it gets deeper. The author notes that the scientific process itself isn't just about gathering raw, uninterpreted facts. The Quine-Duhem thesis demonstrates that scientific data is underdetermined. Now, what does that mean? It essentially means that raw facts don't just speak for themselves. You can often have multiple, completely different theories explaining the exact same set of data. Scientists always have to evaluate theories through a network of non-empirical criteria, things like mathematical elegance, simplicity, and yes, their own broader worldview commitments. This brings us perfectly to Section 3, Science's Unseen Foundations. What's truly mind-blowing here is that empirical science actually relies heavily on foundations it simply cannot prove. Science is an incredibly powerful tool, but it requires a staggering amount of assumed faith just to step foot in a laboratory. The author argues that without 5 specific non-empirical presuppositions, science couldn't even begin. First, physical realism. Assuming an objective world actually exists outside our minds. Second, cognitive reliability, trusting that our human brains can actually apprehend truth. Third, immaterial logic and math. These are non-physical principles required for all equations. Fourth, uniformity and causality, assuming nature operates by consistent laws. And fifth, objective moral values, the assumption that scientists actually ought to report their data honestly. Think about it, science cannot empirically prove a single one of these things. It just has to completely assume them to function. Because data needs to be interpreted, worldview commitments play a huge role. This means the real culture war isn't actually between neutral science and religious faith. It's a clash between two massive, full-bodied philosophical worldviews. Take a look at this striking quote from Harvard geneticist Richard Lewontin, which perfectly captures the dynamic. He openly admits to a prior a priori commitment to materialism, the idea that physical matter is all that exists. He flat out states they cannot allow a divine foot in the door. That is a philosophical starting point, guys, not an empirical conclusion.
Let's move on to Section 4, the theistic roots.
Chronologically, the source material argues something pretty striking. While ancient civilizations obviously made incredible technological advances, a sustained, self-correcting empirical science uniquely broke through in the West. But why? Well, the author argues other worldviews had intellectual impasses. Animism viewed nature as divine or full of unpredictable spirits, which made experimentation culturally taboo. Greek philosophy relied heavily on logical deduction that kind of assumed you could figure out the universe just by sitting and thinking about first principles. But the 16th and 17th centuries brought a massive shift based on a completely different view of the cosmos.
This historical reality shows that specific biblical theological convictions were literally the axioms that empowered pioneers of modern science, people like Kepler, Galileo, Boyle, and Newton. They believed in a transcendent God, which basically de-deified nature, making it safe to investigate. They believed in a contingent order, meaning God freely created the universe. So we can't just deduce how it works from an armchair, we actually have to go out and empirically observe it. And they believed humans were created in the imago Dei, the image of God, trusting that our minds were specifically designed to comprehend this ordered cosmos.
And finally, Section 5, a coherent alternative.
So, if strong scientism is a closed, self-defeating loop, what exactly is the alternative? Well, the paper suggests that canonical biblical theology promotes a framework known as critical realism. This is a posture that affirms the real, external, material world, but it also fully accepts those non-empirical prerequisites of knowledge we talked about. Because it accepts an external reality, faith in this view isn't just some blind leap into the dark. Instead, it's treated as an open invitation to examine divine action that supposedly occurred in actual, testable, space-time history.
The author leans on Walter C. Kaiser Jr.'s Promise Plan framework to explain this. The argument is that this space-time redemption is a concrete historical campaign to reverse three specific ancient cosmic rebellions outlined in the biblical text: the loss of sacred space in Eden, the corruption of human lineage at Hermon, and the disinheritance of the nations of Babel. The really vital point being made here is that this theological framework isn't just a collection of abstract, ethereal concepts floating in the clouds. It's a narrative that is meant to be grounded in testable human history. Which brings us to a massively important historical claim. Drawing on the Apostle Paul's writings in 1 Corinthians 15, the author notes that the claims of the resurrection are actually put forward as empirical, historical evidence. Using a minimal facts approach, championed by contemporary historians, the author points to a core bedrock of data that is widely accepted by even critical scholars. Things like Jesus' crucifixion, his post-mortem appearances, the radical, sudden transformation of his disciples, and the very early proclamation of these events in Jerusalem. This presents a way of knowing, an epistemology, that directly invites historical testing. So, to summarize the author's entire analysis, strong scientism operates as a closed, naturalistic system. It relies on physicalist reductionism, rejects anything unobservable, dismisses historical testability as a path to absolute truth, and ultimately collapses into a self-refuting logic trap. On the flip side, the author argues that canonical biblical theology provides a critical realist foundation. It accepts the immaterial prerequisites of knowledge, like logic and morality, and posits an open cosmos where divine agency actually occurs within coherent, testable, space-time history. Look, at the end of the day, empirical science is an absolutely brilliant, powerful tool for understanding the physical mechanisms of our universe. We rely on it constantly. But, as Mark Bates argues, when we try to make that tool the only measure of truth, we basically blind ourselves to the very foundations that make science possible in the first place. So, as we wrap up this explainer, I'll leave you with this. When you are examining the full scope of the universe, will you restrict yourself to just a metal detector? Or will you use a worldview capable of seeing the whole treasure?